Chapter 1. The Pre-Capitalist World. Before Wall Street, before credit cards, before money itself, there was the silent nod of agreement, the hand extended with grain, livestock, salt, or tools. This was not capitalism. This was the murky, improvised world of barter, the earliest flicker of exchange that would one day ignite global markets. But in the beginning, it was all about survival and trust. Imagine a Sumerian farmer in 3000 BCE, standing at the edge of a dusty market square, his hands calloused from weeks of planting barley. He needs leather sandals. The tanner has them. But the tanner doesn't want barley, he wants wool. The farmer doesn't have wool. So begins the hunt. Find a shepherd who wants barley, trade for wool, then circle back to the tanner. This exhausting three-way shuffle was the reality of early exchange. A slow, personal, and painfully inefficient system that depended entirely on timing, memory, and mutual need. Yet even in this primitive economy, patterns emerged. In Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, temples weren't just houses of worship. They were storehouses, banks, and bureaucratic hubs. Priests kept meticulous records of who owed what, in the form of clay tablets etched with cuneiform signs. A worker might be paid in grain or beer. A debt might be recorded as owed labor. The concept of value was there, it just hadn't yet been minted. In this world, value was tied to the material. Livestock wasn't just food or labor, it was wealth on hooves. Salt preserved meat and made bland grains edible, so it was precious. Tools, textiles, and metalwork were all tokens of status and trade. But none of these were universal. What held value in Babylon might be worthless in the Indus Valley. Every region spoke its own economic dialect, and trust had to be built face to face, tribe to tribe. Then came bronze. Bronze changed everything. The alloy of copper and tin became not only the foundation of weapons and tools, but the beginning of something more abstract, standardization. A bronze axe head could be weighed, measured, compared. Unlike sheep or barley, it didn't spoil, wander off, or grow old. Slowly, communities began using ingots, lumps of shaped bronze, as a medium of exchange. It wasn't money, not yet, but it was an early step towards something astonishing. Value that could move through hands, unspoiled by time. In Egypt, where the Nile's steady rhythm supported a powerful and centralized state, barter was systematized with brutal efficiency. Pharaohs controlled the grain, which meant they controlled life itself. Scribes recorded harvests and issued rations. The economy revolved not around profit, but provisioning. Yet trade still thrived along the Nile and beyond. Egyptian traders returned from Nubia with gold, ivory, and incense, from the Levant with cedar wood and wine. Their ships, carved with divine eyes to see their way across dangerous waters, were some of the earliest vessels of long-distance trade. And with them, an idea began to spread, that wealth could be moved, negotiated, multiplied. The Minoans of Crete, flourishing around 2000 BCE, built palatial complexes that functioned as economic centers. They traded across the Aegean Sea, their ships ferrying olive oil, pottery, and textiles. Their wealth wasn't stored in vaults, but in storerooms, giant jars of oil, grain, and precious goods. Yet their economy, too, rested on reputation, relationship, and ritual. The idea of anonymous exchange, of buying from someone you didn't know and didn't trust, was still centuries away. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa revealed another twist. A meticulously organized urban economy with standard weights and measures, grid-like streets, and advanced sanitation. Seals with animal motifs suggest trade connections, perhaps even early branding. But no royal palaces, no massive temples, no obvious elites. Was this a society where commerce spread horizontally, not vertically? The mystery lingers, unsolved. Meanwhile, in China's Yellow River Valley, early dynasties like the Shang used cowrie shells as tokens of value, long before metal coins. These tiny, shiny shells, collected from faraway oceans, were more than pretty objects. They were a symbol of rarity, of status, and in some ways, of the future, a standardized item of exchange. But like bronze, or barley, or salt, their value still depended on the context of custom, proximity, and power. Power was always part of the equation. In ancient trade, rulers controlled the flow of goods. They taxed caravans, appointed officials to monitor markets, and launched military campaigns to seize trade routes. Economics and empire were born as twins, bound by ambition. As kingdoms grew, so did their economic reach, and their desire to shape what counted as wealth. By the time of the Phoenicians, a merchant people based in the cities of Tyre and Sidon, trade had taken on a new form. These were not conquerors. They were connectors. Their ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean, bringing purple dye, cedar wood, glass, and metalwork from port to port. They spread not only goods, but alphabets, ideas, and systems of measurement. In their wake came markets, busy, multilingual spaces where strangers bartered across cultures, using weights, signs, and language itself as tools of negotiation. And then came the Greeks. In the agora, the open-air market at the heart of every Greek city-state, exchange became something more refined. Coinage was on the horizon, but not yet dominant. Instead, trust, civic reputation, and hospitality governed transactions. A merchant's word was as valuable as his wares. Barter persisted, but new ideas were blooming about property, interest, fairness, and the tension between private gain and public good. Plato wrote critically of those who sought profit without virtue. Aristotle warned against crematistics, the art of making money for its own sake. Even as trade expanded, suspicion of unchecked accumulation lingered like a shadow. In Rome, that suspicion began to erode. Though the early republic still clung to agrarian ideals, by the late republic and into the empire, commerce was everywhere. Roman roads stitched the Mediterranean world together. Markets pulsed in every city. Contracts were written, debts enforced, goods shipped from Africa to Gaul to Syria. Barter still happened in villages and provinces. But in the heart of the empire, abstraction had arrived. Roman law began to define property, liability, and commerce in strikingly modern terms. Coins were minted in staggering numbers. Wealth flowed upward, often violently. But even in Rome, capitalism as we know it had not yet been born. There were no corporations, no stock exchanges, no concept of reinvested capital or competition-driven innovation. What existed was a system of accumulation tied to conquest, land, slavery, and favor. The rich grew richer through power, not productivity. Yet the foundations were being laid: roads, contracts, coins, and a belief in private ownership as both right and virtue. The world before capitalism was not simple. It was a mosaic of barter, tribute, theft, and trade. A world of markets without market economies, of prices without price systems. But the seeds were there. Seeds of exchange, of stored value, of material ambition. Bronze, barley, cowries, and contracts, they were all ancestors of the dollar bill and the digital wallet. And as Rome rose and fell, Those seeds were scattered across continents, waiting to bloom in a new world driven not by custom or conquest alone, but by the restless, relentless logic of capital. Chapter 2. The Birth of Money. The fall of barter was inevitable. The more people traded, the more obvious it became. Barter was too slow, too clumsy, too limited. Markets needed something portable, durable, divisible, and above all, trustworthy. What the world needed was money. Not just value, but value that could move. Somewhere around 600 BCE, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, that idea took shape in metal. The kingdom of Lydia, under King Alyattes, and later his son Croesus, whose name still echoes as a symbol of wealth, struck the first known coins. These weren't just decorative tokens. They were electrum discs, a natural alloy of gold and silver, stamped with the royal lion, a mark of authority and, more importantly, a promise. The king guaranteed its value. This changed everything. With coinage came the possibility of trade with strangers. No more haggling over whether a goat was worth 2 sacks of grain or 3. Now, value had a symbol. Coins could move from hand to hand, city to city, without losing meaning. In the Greek city-states that followed, coinage spread like wildfire. Athens minted silver drachmas bearing the image of the owl of wisdom. Sparta, suspicious of luxury and profit, used iron rods deliberately designed to be inconvenient. But money had found its form, round, metallic, marked with power. And power was the key. Money wasn't born in the market, it was born in the palace. Every coin carried the face of a king, a god, an empire. It said, "This has value because I say it does." It was a political act, a tool of control and confidence. The state didn't just allow trade. It made trade possible by defining the unit of value, ensuring its weight, punishing counterfeiting, and collecting taxes. The link between money and power was forged in fire and sealed in law. As coins spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, they became more than tools of commerce. They became tools of propaganda. Rome understood this perfectly. Roman emperors stamped their victories into silver and gold, turning currency into storytelling. A denarius wasn't just money. It was a message in your pocket. Caesar conquered Gaul. Augustus brought peace. Trajan expanded the empire. Every transaction became a whisper of imperial glory. Gold, in particular, held an almost mythical power. It was rare, incorruptible, beautiful, and hard to fake. Across cultures, gold became the metal of kings, temples, and tribute. It didn't rust, it didn't fade, and it could be melted, shaped, and measured. But more than that, it seemed eternal. Even today, in the age of blockchain and algorithmic trading, gold still haunts our financial imaginations. We call markets bullish or bearish based on its behavior. We hoard it in vaults. We panic when its price surges or crashes. Its shimmer has never quite faded. But gold alone wasn't enough. Empires needed systems. In China, during the Zhou dynasty, bronze coins began to replace cowries. Later, under the Qin and Han, the state imposed a standardized currency, part of a sweeping unification of weights, measures, and writing. Coins took the shape of knives and spades before evolving into round discs with square holes, symbolic of heaven and earth. Chinese money, unlike its Western cousins, was less about kings and more about harmony. Yet its purpose was the same: to oil the machinery of trade and tax. In India, punch-marked coins emerged around the same time as Lydia's inventions. They bore no images of rulers, only symbols: sun, wheel, tree, elephant. trade flourished along the Ganges and beyond, as the subcontinent became a crucible of economic innovation, linking merchants from the Mediterranean to Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Persian kings minted gold derricks and silver sigloi, stamped with archers or lions, symbols of royal authority. The Achaemenid Empire stretched from Anatolia to the Indus, and with its roads, caravansaries, and coinage, it stitched together one of the first truly transcontinental economies. All of this, the coins, the kings, the caravans, did something profound. They made it possible to separate wealth from objects. A coin could buy bread, yes, but it could also sit in a chest for decades, waiting. It didn't rot like grain or limp like a goat. It was potential. And that changed how humans thought about value itself. Money introduced abstraction. 10 coins were not 10 loaves or 10 bolts of cloth. They were power in waiting. And with abstraction came mobility. A merchant in Athens could sell olive oil and invest the proceeds in tin from Britain or wine from Phoenicia. Capital began to flow. Not just goods, but wealth, intention, ambition. And with that came risk, calculation, and the first glimmers of financial thinking. But money also brought hierarchy. It amplified difference. The man with more coins could hire others, buy protection, influence politics. Markets grew, but so did inequality. Slavery didn't disappear with money, it adapted. Debts could be bought and sold. Land could be claimed, taxed, and monopolized. The same tool that fueled trade could fuel exploitation. The coin, like the sword, could serve any master. Yet still, the markets pulsed. In the bustling agoras of Greece, the forums of Rome, the bazaars of Persia, the docks of Alexandria, money sang its seductive tune. It allowed for the rise of professions, the banker, the trader, the money changer. It enabled empires to plan, to pay armies, to build aqueducts and amphitheaters. And it allowed ordinary people to dream, to save, to lend, to buy a better life. The world had changed. The age of barter, of wool for sandals and beer for bronze, had faded into memory. Now the clink of coins echoed through every transaction, binding people not just by need, but by number, symbol, and trust in a shared fiction. Because that's what money ultimately became. A story everyone agreed to believe, a promise engraved in metal, a whisper of kings, a measure of worth, human, material, and imagined. And yet, as the coins changed hands and the empires grew fat, a new tension began to stir. Between the market and the palace, between the profit of trade and the control of rulers, between the rising power of wealth and the old power of blood. A new chapter was coming, one of spice, ships, and the ruthless reach of global ambition. But that would come later. For now the coin had taken root, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 3. Merchants and Monasteries. The Roman Empire had fallen, but its coins still glinted in the soil. Roads crumbled, cities emptied, and for a time, it seemed the economy itself had collapsed into memory. In Western Europe, trade retreated behind castle walls and monastery gates. Gold vanished from circulation. Barter returned in places where money once flowed. But even in the darkness of the so-called Dark Ages, exchange never stopped. It simply changed form. And beneath the surface, the seeds of a new economy began to sprout in quiet rebellion against both power and piety. In medieval Europe, the church loomed over everything, not just heaven and earth, but markets, morals, and money. Christian doctrine viewed profit with suspicion. The Gospels spoke of camels and needles, of overturned tables in the temple. To lend money at interest was to risk your soul. Usury, as it was called, was a sin, and for centuries, the line between fair trade and sinful greed was drawn not by merchants, but by theologians. This posed a problem. The world was changing. Populations were growing. Towns were reawakening. Pilgrims and crusaders moved across continents, creating demand for horses, armor, food, and lodging. Trade routes reopened, markets stirred. But how to buy and sell without violating divine law? How to profit without damning your soul? The answer came slowly, and in many forms. Monasteries, those bastions of spiritual retreat, became unlikely centers of economic activity. Their lands were vast, their workers numerous, their granaries full. They cultivated grapes for wine, herbs for medicine, and wool for cloth. They stored grain, brewed beer, and copied books. They lent tools and sometimes even silver, carefully framed not as usury, but as charity or shared enterprise. The line between holy duty and economic function blurred with every harvest. Meanwhile, cities began to grow around cathedrals and crossroads. Markets re-emerged, not just for goods, but for ideas. And at the heart of these new urban economies stood the guilds. These were not proto-corporations, but rather tightly knit associations of craftsmen and merchants. The bakers, the weavers, the goldsmiths, the shoemakers. A guild regulated quality, prices, training, and membership. It set rules, protected secrets, and punished cheats. To buy a pair of boots in medieval Paris was not to interact with a business. It was to interact with a system, one that prized stability over innovation and fairness over competition. Guilds kept power local. They limited production, discouraged undercutting, and maintained community over profit. They were not capitalist, but they were organized. And within their walls, people learned to think about labor, pricing, and risk in ways that would echo into the future. But while Europe clung to caution, Islamic civilizations to the south and east built vast commercial networks with astonishing sophistication. From the ports of the Arabian Peninsula to the caravan cities of Central Asia, merchants thrived under a different set of rules. Ones that embraced trade not as a necessary evil, but as a noble act. The Prophet Muhammad himself had been a merchant, and Islamic law, or Sharia, developed an intricate financial system that allowed commerce to flourish while respecting religious limits. Usury was also forbidden in Islam. But rather than condemning lending outright, Islamic finance developed alternatives: profit-sharing partnerships, deferred payments, and risk-sharing contracts. A merchant in Baghdad could finance a shipment to India with the help of a mudaraba, a partnership in which one party provided capital and the other labor, with profits shared and losses borne by the investor. This was not charity. It was strategy, rooted in trust and law. The result was a web of trade that stretched from Andalusia to China. Muslim merchants carried spices, textiles, glass, and knowledge across continents. They used bills of exchange, letters of credit, and double-entry accounting centuries before these tools reached Europe. In the great bazaars of Cairo, Damascus, and Samarkand, commerce was not just tolerated, it was honored. And yet, even in the Islamic world, moral limits remained. Markets opened with prayer. Inspectors monitored weights and measures. Hoarding was condemned. Cheating was sin. But the overall spirit was different. Trade was seen as a path to both wealth and righteousness, provided one dealt fairly and honored one's word. Back in Europe, things moved more slowly. The church still set the tone. Even as trade revived, moneylenders operated in moral shadows. Christians were forbidden to charge interest, But Jews, excluded from many professions and forbidden from owning land, found themselves pushed into finance. It was a dangerous niche. Jewish moneylenders served kings and lords, built banking networks, and helped finance wars. But they also became targets of resentment, persecution, and violence. Their position in the economy was essential, yet precarious. In the cracks of Christian morality, a new kind of financial power was emerging, one born of exclusion and necessity. As the High Middle Ages bloomed, towns like Bruges, Venice, and Genoa became hubs of trade and credit. Fairs and festivals turned into marketplaces where wool met wine, silk met silver, and regional economies connected into something broader. Italian merchant families began to develop rudimentary banking. They created partnerships that pooled capital, letters of credit that moved money across borders, and notaries that formalized contracts. Slowly, the moral stigma around money began to erode. Theologians revised their stance. Interest could be tolerated in certain cases, especially when risk was involved. Profit was no longer automatically sin. By the 13th century, even the papacy had bankers. The Knights Templar operated a trans-European financial system that protected pilgrim wealth and transferred funds between kingdoms. The lines between sin and system blurred further with every transaction. But the tension never fully vanished. To make money was to dance with temptation. Merchants justified their profits by giving to the poor, funding churches, or cloaking their wealth in humility. In portraits, the merchant counts his coins with one hand and holds a Bible in the other. Commerce had found its place, but it had not yet claimed its throne. And so the medieval world teetered between two impulses: the yearning for prosperity and the fear of damnation. Markets expanded, guilds regulated, banks crept into cities. Yet moral limits pressed down like cathedral ceilings, heavy, majestic, unyielding. Still, the structure was shifting. Beneath the rituals of trade and the rules of religion, a new hunger stirred, for autonomy, for mobility, for profit untethered from feudal obligation or divine permission. The merchant, once a marginal figure, now stood at the center of an emerging drama, between old faith and new ambition. Soon, the world would open. Oceans would be crossed. Gold would be found. And the moral chains that had bound money to the soul would begin to loosen, link by link, coin by coin. Chapter 4. Capitalism Goes Global. The world cracked open with the scent of cinnamon. It wasn't steel or silver that first drove capitalism beyond the horizon. It was spice. Fragile, fragrant, and astonishingly valuable, spices ignited a hunger that could not be sated. And in their pursuit, merchants transformed trade into empire, profit into power, and ports into the beating hearts of a new economic age. Long before globalization had a name, it had a root. Winding from the rainforests of Southeast Asia to the dusty souks of Arabia, through Persian deserts, across the Black Sea, and finally into the markets of Europe. Pepper from India, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, cloves from the Moluccas, saffron from Iran. These weren't luxuries. They were obsessions. To a medieval European palate, dull and salted to death, the sharp sting of spice was a miracle. And to a merchant, it was gold in powdered form. But getting it was treacherous. Every pound of cinnamon passed through dozens of hands. Arab traders, Persian caravans, Turkish toll collectors, Venetian wholesalers. Each link in the chain added its price, its tax, its risk. And so, in the late Middle Ages, a new kind of ambition began to rise. To control the chain, not just ride it. This was the beginning of long-distance capitalism. not just buying and selling, but building systems of control across seas, cities, and centuries. Nowhere embodied this shift more than Venice. The city of canals was never built for beauty. It was built for trade. Rising from the marshes of a lagoon, protected by water and powered by ships, Venice became the broker between East and West. By the 13th century, its galleys ruled the Mediterranean. Venetian merchants signed contracts in Alexandria, bribed officials in Constantinople, and carried everything from silk to soap to salt back to Europe. They weren't just buying. They were organizing, insuring, investing. Venetian trade was layered in legal structure, backed by naval muscle, and lubricated by a culture that valued cunning over crusade. And they weren't alone. To the west, Genoa challenged Venetian supremacy with a fleet of its own. Genoese bankers financed crusades, their ships roamed the Black Sea, and their agents established colonies along vital trade routes. Where Venice dominated the Adriatic, Genoa ruled the Tyrrhenian. The two cities fought wars, signed treaties, undercut each other's deals, yet in doing so, they expanded the very fabric of European commerce. Trade became a battlefield and profit a weapon. But not all merchant empires sailed warm seas. In the cold waters of the North and Baltic, another force was rising, the Hanseatic League. It wasn't an empire in the traditional sense. There were no kings, no crowns, no central army. Instead, the Hanse was a confederation. Over 100 towns from Lübeck to Riga to Bruges, bound together by mutual interest and a deep commitment to control trade. Their strength lay in cooperation. Hanseatic merchants negotiated as a bloc. They boycotted ports that didn't grant them privileges. They standardized weights and measures. They built warehouses called contouré in foreign cities, defended convoys against pirates, and even fielded fleets when needed. Timber, grain, furs, wax, fish, these were their goods. But their true product was power through unity. In the markets of London and Bergen, Hanseatic traders were feared and resented. Locals chafed under their monopolies. Kings alternated between inviting them and expelling them. But the League endured for centuries, not through brute force, but through careful strategy, mutual insurance, and relentless negotiation. It was capitalism by consensus, and it worked. Still, it had limits. The Huns relied on overland connections and coastal trade. Venice and Genoa depended on Arab middlemen and the Byzantine nexus. All of them faced the same problem. The source of their wealth, the spices, silks, and rare goods, lay far beyond their control. The East was distant, powerful, and self-sufficient. European merchants could buy, but they could not dictate. This frustration deepened as demand soared. The more Europe hungered for Eastern goods, the more it chafed at the prices and politics of access. When the Ottomans captured Constantinople in 1453, many European powers feared their trade lifeline was in danger. What if the flow of spice could be cut off entirely? The answer was simple and radical. Find a new route. Sail around. Though this push into the oceans belongs to the next chapter, the foundation was already laid by the merchant empires of the medieval world. They had created the blueprint: structured trade, long-term investment, protection of routes, and the pursuit of monopoly. These were not just local markets anymore. This was systems-level thinking. And in these systems, the role of the state began to shift. Kings once viewed merchants as useful nuisances, necessary for taxes, but unworthy of power. Now, they saw them as allies. Merchants brought wealth, and wealth meant armies. In return, Kings offered charters, legal protections, and sometimes exclusive trading rights. The alliance of throne and trade was forming, and it would redefine the future of global commerce. But even amid this expansion, capitalism had not yet arrived in full. These merchant networks were ambitious, but they operated within a world still governed by limits. Guilds still protected crafts. Religion still frowned on excess. Trade was growing, but production remained local, small-scale, and slow. There were no factories, no mechanization, no reinvestment of surplus to generate more surplus. That storm still waited on the horizon. And yet, something had changed. A Genoese ship docking in Bruges could carry news, credit, goods, and ideas across thousands of miles. A Hanseatic convoy could move bulk cargo more efficiently than any medieval army. A Venetian merchant might fund a voyage, hedge the risk, and collect interest, all without touching a single spice himself. Capital was learning to move faster than people. It was learning to flow. And like the spices that drove it, it left a scent behind, a promise of wealth, a taste of something more. In palaces and counting houses, on docks and in city halls, the question began to form. What if trade wasn't just a means, but an end? What if profit could be pursued not as a sideline, but as a mission? What if the spice didn't just flow, but multiplied? That question would soon be answered. But first, ships would have to leave the map. Oceans would have to be crossed, and the cost in gold, blood, and empires would be unimaginable. Chapter 5. Capitalism and Colonialism. When the ships finally crossed the ocean, they didn't bring spices, they brought steel. The age of exploration was not driven by curiosity, but by hunger. For gold, for control, for markets no longer choked by middlemen or foreign empires. The compass and the cannon had come of age together, and in their wake the world would be carved, claimed, and consumed. Capitalism was about to grow teeth. It began with gold. When Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't find a new route to Asia, but he did find people wearing gold. That was enough. In the letters he sent back to Spain, he barely mentioned the landscape. What mattered was that the land could be taken, the people enslaved, and the metals extracted. His voyages were financed by crown and capital alike, and what he brought back was not discovery, it was proof. There was wealth out there, waiting to be seized. Spain and Portugal raced to plant flags. Conquistadors swept through the Americas with fire and disease, claiming vast territories in the name of God and King. But always, beneath the banners and the crosses, was the glint of precious metal. In Mexico and Peru, the Aztec and Inca empires were broken apart, their gold melted down, their temples pillaged. Silver from Potosi and present-day Bolivia poured into Spanish coffers, so much of it that global prices shifted. The Spanish crown took its royal fifth, and the rest was funneled into wars, debts, and more expeditions. Empire was expensive. Plunder was faster than trade. But it was never just about metal. As the colonies grew, so did their appetite for labor. Native populations collapsed under the weight of forced work and foreign disease. Millions died within a generation. Entire cultures were erased. The survivors were often enslaved, resettled, or absorbed into colonial economies designed to extract maximum value with minimal rights. When there weren't enough native bodies to exploit, European powers turned to Africa. Thus began the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest engines of capitalist expansion. Over 12 million Africans were captured, chained, and sold into a system that saw human beings not as people, but as units of labor. Ships packed them like cargo, with less space than a coffin, across the Middle Passage. Those who survived were sold in auctions, branded, beaten, and worked to death on plantations growing sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee. The profits were staggering. Slavery became foundational. It wasn't a deviation, it was the model. European investors financed slave voyages. Insurance companies wrote policies on slave ships. Banks handled the profits. Governments taxed the goods. Merchants reinvested in more land, more ships, more slaves. Capitalism was no longer just about trade. It was about extraction. Forced labor, stolen land, and systematic violence weren't bugs in the system. They were the system. At the heart of this new global economy stood the plantation. It was brutal, efficient, and deeply modern. Large-scale monoculture designed for export, not local use. Overseers with whips, quotas, and books. Workers with no rights, no wages, no freedom. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean became some of the most profitable operations on Earth. They consumed lives at industrial speed, but the returns more than justified the loss, at least to those who held the ledgers. And in Europe, the money flowed. Amsterdam, London, Lisbon, Seville. These cities grew fat on colonial wealth. Sugar sweetened the tea of the middle class. Cotton fed the looms of early industrialists. Tobacco lined the pockets of nobles and financiers alike. Global capitalism had found its pattern. Take from the periphery, enrich the core. Send ships out empty, return them full. Hide the blood in the numbers. Governments embraced this system under the theory of mercantilism. The idea was simple and ruthless. A nation's power depended on its stockpile of gold and silver. To grow rich, you had to export more than you imported. Colonies existed to feed the mother country raw materials while buying its manufactured goods. Tariffs and trade barriers were tools of war. Commerce wasn't competition, it was conquest in disguise. The East India Companies took this logic further. Founded in the early 1600s, the Dutch and British East India Companies were not just trading firms. They were sovereign entities with their own armies, legal systems, and tax policies. They signed treaties, built fortresses, waged wars. In India, Indonesia, and beyond, they operated as corporate states. Their goal was profit. Their method was control. Their consequence was chaos. Local economies were gutted and reshaped to serve distant masters. Artisans in Bengal, once famed for their fine textiles, found their markets flooded, their prices crushed, their labor devalued. African kingdoms were pulled into endless cycles of war to feed the slave trade. The Americas became fields of death and extraction. And yet, the money kept moving. Sugar to Europe, guns to Africa, slaves to the Americas, a triangle of exploitation, efficient and endless. But capitalism didn't stop at the edge of the colony. At home, the very idea of profit was being reimagined. A merchant no longer needed to handle goods directly. He could invest in a voyage, receive dividends, diversify risk. Insurance markets blossomed. Stock exchanges formed. Portfolios grew. Profit could be multiplied without touching the violence that produced it. Wealth was now paper, ink, and trust in institutions built on blood. And still, gold mattered. It underpinned currencies, financed wars, and remained the ultimate measure of worth. Every coin was stamped with a king's face, but behind the throne stood the invisible empire of capital. And as the wealth of nations grew, so did their appetite for more. This wasn't just trade, it was transformation. Capitalism had broken through the local and become global. It no longer needed the slow rhythms of guilds or the moral hand-wringing of theologians. It had found a new religion: growth. Its temples were counting houses, its priests were bankers, and its offerings were measured in profit margins, not prayers. Yet the cost was incalculable. Entire peoples displaced, cultures destroyed, ecosystems drained. Capitalism was no longer a quiet exchange between neighbors. It had become a storm, a system driven by expansion, justified by ideology, and fueled by human lives, turned into capital. The map of the world had changed. Europe sat at the center, not because of geography or genius, but because of violence and vision. Colonialism had made it rich. Capitalism would make it powerful. And in the next chapter of this unfolding drama, the tools of plunder would evolve once again, this time into machines, markets, and the gears of a revolution that would shake the very earth. Chapter 6. The Dutch and the Dividend. The age of conquest had opened the world, but it was the Dutch who figured out how to buy it, piece by piece, share by share. In muddy ports and candlelit counting houses, they didn't just trade spices or gold, they traded risk itself. They invented a system so powerful, so abstract, that it could build empires without armies and generate wealth without war. In 17th century Amsterdam, capitalism took its final form, the joint stock corporation. It began, as so many things did, with spices. The Dutch Republic, a scrappy confederation of merchant-led provinces, had risen out of rebellion against the Spanish crown. It had no king, no vast empire, only windmills, ships, and a fierce belief in trade. And what it wanted most was a share of the Asian spice trade, which had made the Portuguese rich and the Spanish bolder. But sending ships around the Cape of Good Hope was no small feat. The journey took years. Crews died. Ships sank. Markets changed mid-voyage. The risk was staggering. The reward, if one survived, was immense. At first, merchants pooled their money to fund individual expeditions. A group of wealthy investors would back a fleet, hoping it returned with enough nutmeg and cloves to justify the gamble. If it didn't, the loss was total. If it did, the profits could be absurd. But this model was fragile, short-term, and dependent on luck. There had to be a better way. In 1602, the Dutch government chartered a new kind of entity, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Unlike earlier ventures, this company would not dissolve after a single voyage. It was granted a monopoly on Dutch trade with Asia, allowed to build forts, sign treaties, and even wage war. And most radically, it would be owned by shareholders, ordinary citizens who could buy and sell pieces of the company without ever setting foot on a ship. This was the invention of the modern corporation. The VOC was a legal person. It could own property, sue and be sued, and exist beyond the lives of its founders. Capital was raised by selling shares to the public. Each investor received a certificate of ownership, a claim not just to one ship's cargo, but to a slice of the company's future. The risk of trade had been sliced, priced, and spread across thousands of hands. Losses could be absorbed. Profits could be paid out in dividends. And for the first time, an enterprise could expand without limit. Its growth tied not to conquest or inheritance, but to confidence in the market. Confidence, of course, required trust. Investors wanted to know what their money was doing. And so began another innovation, corporate accounting. The VOC kept books, published reports, and paid annual dividends. It hired professional managers, separated ownership from control, and created mechanisms for oversight. It was messy, political, and often corrupt, but it was revolutionary. Amsterdam became the center of this financial world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was born, an open space where investors could buy and sell VOC shares. Prices fluctuated based on rumors, ship arrivals, and colonial news. A secondary market emerged, allowing people to speculate on the value of shares they didn't own. Brokers developed complex contracts to hedge risk, and mathematicians began to model uncertainty using probability and statistics. Capitalism met math, and the numbers began to tell stories of their own. No longer was wealth tied to land, gold, or labor. It could now exist as ink on paper, a moving average, a whisper in the wind. A person could grow rich or ruined without touching a single good. Speculation became a profession, leverage became a tool, finance became a world unto itself. And yet the VOC was more than numbers. It was also a state within a state. In Asia, it built a commercial empire with military power. It conquered ports, imposed monopolies, and waged brutal wars to control the spice trade. In the Banda Islands, entire populations were massacred to secure nutmeg trees. Fortresses were raised in Batavia, now Jakarta. Treaties were signed at gunpoint. The profits that fueled Dutch prosperity were soaked in blood, enforced by cannon, and sustained by slavery. Back in Europe, however, the company appeared almost magical. Dividends flowed, investors prospered. Dutch society began to change. Wealth was no longer inherited, it was bought. Middle-class citizens could now build fortunes not by farming or crafting, but by purchasing pieces of faraway ventures. The gap between those who worked and those who speculated widened. A new class emerged, the investor, and with them came a new culture. Amsterdam buzzed with information, gossip, pamphlets, and market reports. Coffee houses became informal trading floors. Newspapers published shipping news. Confidence and panic rose and fell like tides. The city had become the nervous system of a decentralized empire, one built not on territory, but on trust in the dividend. But this trust was fragile. Speculation could spiral. In the 1630s, the Dutch experienced one of the world's first financial bubbles, tulip mania. What began as a fascination with exotic flowers turned into a frenzy of speculation. Tulip bulbs were bought and sold at ever-rising prices. Futures contracts were traded for flowers that hadn't even bloomed. At its peak, a single bulb could be worth more than a house. And then, suddenly, the prices collapsed. Fortunes evaporated. The bubble burst. It was a lesson that would repeat itself across the centuries. When money becomes belief, the collapse of belief becomes catastrophe. Still, the corporation endured. Other countries took notice. The British would soon form their own East India Company. The French would try the same. Stocks and bonds became tools of state finance. Wars were funded by credit. Colonial expansion was backed by investors. The logic of capitalism, risk distributed, profit pursued, control abstracted, was now embedded in law, culture, and ambition. The VOC was not eternal. It grew bloated, corrupt, and overextended. By the late 1700s, it collapsed under the weight of its own bureaucracy and was nationalized by the Dutch state. But its legacy remained. It had proven that capitalism could scale, that trade could be industrialized, that ownership could be democratized, and that money could move faster than matter. The world had changed again. Power no longer had to wear a crown. It could sit quietly in a ledger, gather interest, and shape destinies from behind the scenes. The corporation had been born, and with it, a new chapter in the story of capitalism, one where finance, not force, would begin to steer the ship. And that ship was already heading into a storm of steel, smoke, and revolution. A storm that would reshape not just economies, but the very meaning of work, wealth, and the human role in production. But that is a chapter still to come. For now, the dividend had spoken, and the world was listening. Chapter 7. The British Empire of Trade. The Dutch may have built the blueprint, but it was the British who turned capitalism into empire, and empire into policy. With parchment in one hand and a musket in the other, Britain didn't just trade. It organized the world into a marketplace designed for profit. The ships flew the Union Jack, but behind them churned a logic far more relentless than national pride: the logic of capital. India, China, and Africa were not conquered merely with armies. They were consumed by contracts, commodities, and credit. And Britain, the merchant turned master, orchestrated it all. By the 18th century, the British East India Company had become the most powerful commercial enterprise on earth. Born in 1600 with a royal charter and a modest fleet, it slowly grew into a leviathan of trade and war. Its goal was never charity. It existed to dominate markets and deliver dividends. And its focus quickly turned eastward, toward India, a land of spices, cotton, and endless possibility. India was not a blank slate. It was a mosaic of kingdoms, languages, and ancient commerce. Its textiles, especially the fine muslins and calicos of Bengal, were coveted in Europe. Indian weavers spun threads so delicate they were called woven wind. British merchants could not compete. So they did something simpler. They gained control, first through treaties, then through manipulation, then through outright conquest. The East India Company wasn't just a trader. It became a government. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, it gained control over Bengal's revenues, a region richer than any European kingdom. With tax income and military backing, the company established a parallel state. It minted coins, ran courts, and fielded armies. And it used its authority not to protect Indian markets, but to reshape them. Indian textile production was forcibly redirected. The finest cloth was exported to Britain, while Indian consumers were flooded with cheap British imports made in Manchester's mills. A system once local, skilled, and diverse became colonial, extractive, and dependent. The weavers starved, the merchants profited, and the British government looked the other way, until it no longer could. By the mid-19th century, the East India Company had become a monster even Britain struggled to control. Corruption, rebellion, and mismanagement boiled over in the Indian Revolt of 1857. The British Crown responded not by dismantling the system, but by absorbing it. India became the jewel of the empire, not just geographically, but economically. It was a source of raw materials, a captive market for British goods, and a testing ground for capitalist imperialism. Tea, once a Chinese delicacy, became a British obsession. To feed demand, Britain didn't just buy tea, it built empires around it. The British imported tea from China for years, but the balance of trade was unfavorable. Silver flowed east. So they found an answer: opium. Grown in India under British license, opium was shipped to China and exchanged for tea. When the Chinese emperor tried to stop the flow, Britain responded with war. Not negotiation, war. The Opium Wars of the mid-19th century weren't fought to protect British citizens. They were fought to protect British trade. Gunboats enforced commercial access. China was forced to open its ports, cede Hong Kong, and accept foreign merchants on unequal terms. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was an economic humiliation. The world's oldest continuous civilization, coerced into becoming a supplier of tea and a consumer of poison, all to serve the British balance sheet. Africa followed a different rhythm, but danced to the same tune. In the early phases, British involvement was limited to coastal trading posts, where enslaved people were bought, goods exchanged, and treaties signed under duress. But as the 19th century advanced, Britain's hunger for resources, labor, and markets intensified. Palm oil for soap, rubber for machines, gold for vaults. Africa had what Britain needed, and British companies, missionaries, and eventually soldiers ensured the flow. What had started as a network of trade turned into a machinery of extraction. Railways were laid not to unite nations, but to move commodities from inland mines and plantations to coastal ports. Local economies were dismantled. Traditional crafts were displaced by British imports. African labor was coerced, relocated, and often unpaid. The empire did not civilize, it commercialized. And all of it, India's cotton, China's tea, Africa's minerals, was processed through the same cold mechanism. Goods in, labor out, profit home. In Britain itself, the wealth of empire became the foundation of industrial growth. Capital accumulated in banks and corporations. Cotton from India and America fed the mills of Lancashire. Tea from Assam filled porcelain cups in London parlors. Gold mined from Africa financed new technologies, railroads, and insurance houses. British prosperity was measured in ledgers, not lives. But this wasn't chaos. It was structured. Parliament passed trade laws that favored British goods. Tariffs protected domestic industry while foreign markets were kept open by law, by treaty, or by force. The British Navy ensured shipping routes remained secure. Telegraph wires and steamships compressed time and space. An empire of markets was stitched together with iron and blood. Behind the scenes, mathematics played its part. Actuaries calculated maritime risk, accountants tracked investment, shareholders watched dividend reports, clerks moved numbers that moved nations. It was a system of control so vast and so impersonal that it often disguised its violence. Profits flowed quietly. Suffering screamed from the edges. Yet the system was never invisible to those within it. Indian peasants knew where their grain went. Chinese citizens saw the addiction and the decay. African workers felt the lash of markets they didn't choose. Resistance smoldered in every colony. But for a time, the machine kept turning. By the late 1800s, the British Empire covered a quarter of the globe. Its flag flew from the Caribbean to the Cape, from Singapore to Sierra Leone. But its real legacy wasn't in flags or forts, it was in how it turned capitalism into global policy. Trade wasn't an outcome of empire. Trade was the empire. Markets weren't separate from power, they were power. And Britain, more than any nation before it, wielded that power with the precision of a banker and the ambition of a conqueror. Tea, textiles, takeovers. That was the rhythm of British capitalism. It reshaped the world, restructured economies, and left behind systems that would outlive the empire itself. And yet, something was shifting. The very forces Britain unleashed, mass production, mechanized labor, industrial scale, were about to spiral beyond even imperial control. A new revolution loomed on the horizon, not powered by sail or treaty, but by steam, coal, and iron. The factory would become the new colony, and the worker the new battleground. But for now, the empire stood tall, its foundations built on trade, its future measured in profit margins. The markets had gone global, and they would never return to the shore. Chapter 8. The Industrial Revolution. The world didn't change overnight, but the noise did. Where once there had been the hum of spinning wheels in cottages, now came the roar of steam engines, the hiss of pistons, the clang of hammers on steel. The Industrial Revolution didn't arrive with fanfare, it arrived with soot. And as smoke rose over cities, capitalism found its most transformative stage yet. A world where production exploded, time tightened, labor multiplied, and everything, people included, could be scaled. Britain was the birthplace, not because it had more genius or more ambition, but because it had the right ingredients at the right time. Coal beneath its soil, iron in its hills, waterways and ports to move goods, and, crucially, capital, fueled by centuries of colonial profit and a banking system ready to invest in machines that never slept. The age of the merchant was giving way to the age of the manufacturer. Before this shift, most production had been slow, personal, and local. Weaving happened at home. Blacksmiths worked in village forges. Shoes were made one pair at a time. Labor and life were intertwined, governed by seasons, family, and rhythm. Profit existed, but it was bounded. Then came the factory. Textiles led the charge. Machines like the spinning jenny and the power loom transformed yarn into fabric at speeds no hand could match. Cotton from the American South poured into British mills. Children worked the machines. Women toiled under supervisors. Men shoveled coal into engines. Time, once marked by sun and hunger, was now sliced by whistles and wages. At the center of this new order stood the steam engine. First used to pump water from mines, it soon powered trains, ships, and factories. It didn't get tired. It didn't demand rest. It turned fuel into force. And in doing so, it shattered the limits of human labor. Entire industries reoriented around its rhythm. Iron production soared. Railroads webbed across continents. Goods moved faster, farther, and cheaper than ever before. Coal became the heartbeat of this revolution. Black dust powered engines, warmed homes, and choked lungs. Whole towns formed around mines. Beneath the ground, men and boys scraped at seams of carbon, their bodies bent and their lives shortened. Above ground, furnaces blazed. Steel replaced wood, cities grew taller, bridges stretched wider. The world was being rebuilt in iron and ambition. And behind the machinery, capital swelled. Factories required investment, big, concentrated, long-term. Joint stock companies and investment syndicates pooled money. Banks expanded their services. Credit lines were drawn not just for traders, but for industrialists. The economy became vertically integrated. Mines owned by steel companies, railroads by coal barons, newspapers by factory owners. Everything was linked in a chain of ownership designed to maximize efficiency and returns. This was a new form of capitalism, harder and faster than anything before. Its driving force was no longer just trade or conquest, it was production. Whoever could produce more, cheaper, and faster, won. Innovation was rewarded, slowness was punished. Craftsmanship gave way to uniformity. A shoe was no longer made, it was assembled. But the gains weren't evenly shared. The factory floor was a battlefield of exhaustion. Wages were low, hours long, safety optional. Children worked 10 to 12 hours a day in spinning mills, fingers bloodied, backs hunched. Workers lived in tenements stacked like coffins, breathing air thick with coal smoke and disease. In cities like Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham, life expectancy plummeted. Water was contaminated. Streets were filth. The wealth generated by industry flowed upward, while the cost settled in the lungs and bones of the working poor. Yet resistance stirred. Laborers began to organize. Luddite rebellions smashed machines in protest of lost livelihoods. Trade unions slowly formed, demanding rights, safety, and fair pay. Politicians took note. Reform laws crept into the books, limiting child labor, mandating factory inspections, introducing the idea that perhaps not all profits were earned. Meanwhile, industrialization spread. Belgium followed Britain, then Germany, France, and the United States. Each brought its own twist: more steel, more chemicals, more rail. In America, the telegraph stitched the continent together. In Germany, research labs merged science with commerce. Across the globe, new empires of industry emerged, their foundations built on fossil fuel and factory discipline. But capitalism was not just growing, it was accelerating. Time itself became a commodity. Clocks lined factory walls, minutes were money, speed was profit. Workers had to adjust to new expectations: precision, repetition, endurance. The body became a tool, the mind a cog. Those who couldn't keep up were discarded. And still, for many, the system seemed miraculous. Never before had so much been produced, moved, and consumed. Clothing became affordable, furniture standardized, food preserved in cans and sent to distant cities. Newspapers printed en masse. Illiteracy fell. Cities sparkled with gaslight. The middle class expanded. Comfort spread. Progress seemed unstoppable. But it came with contradictions. While machines promised liberation, they demanded submission. While cities offered opportunity, they devoured nature. While capital built fortunes, it deepened divisions. The Industrial Revolution brought power, but it brought questions too, about dignity, about fairness, about the human cost of endless growth. And in the background, always, loomed the question of the future. Could this pace be sustained? Would the workers rise? Would the machines replace them entirely? Would the world run out of coal, out of land, out of labor? For now, the steam still roared, the steel still burned, and the profits still rose. Capitalism had moved from merchant guilds and colonial ports into ironworks and stock exchanges. It had become mechanized, monetized, and militarized, and it showed no signs of slowing. But something else had awakened in the process. A new class, a new voice, a new power. The industrial worker. No longer isolated in fields or cottages, they now stood shoulder to shoulder in factories and slums, reading newspapers, joining unions, electing leaders. They had no capital, but they had numbers. No dividends, but they had demands. And so, as smokestacks rose and railways spread, the tension thickened. The machine had transformed the world, but not in peace. The age of industry was also the age of inequality. And as capitalism scaled itself to steel, another revolution, social, political, ideological, was waiting in the wings. But the gears kept turning, the factory whistles still blew, and the world, broken and rebuilt, pressed on. Chapter 9. The Rise of the Working Class. The furnaces of the Industrial Revolution had forged more than steel. They had forged a class. Not in theory, but in soot, sweat, and shattered bones. The working class did not emerge with slogans or manifestos, but from necessity. It was built shift by shift, wage by wage, in the cramped tenements and dangerous factories where millions toiled, lived, and died for profits they would never see. As capitalism scaled to new heights of production, the labor beneath it began to stir, and soon to fight back. For the owners of capital, the 19th century was an age of triumph. Railroads crisscrossed continents, factories spewed goods into global markets, banking dynasties bloomed. A man with the right connections, the right investments, and the right luck could amass fortunes in months. Palaces were built, art was collected, names were etched into museums and boulevards. It was, as Americans would later call it, the Gilded Age, a time when everything gleamed, at least on the surface. But beneath the gold was rust. In Britain, in France, in Germany, and especially in the rapidly industrializing United States, workers labored for pennies in conditions that made the old feudal system look almost kind. 12-hour shifts were standard. Children were expected to work as soon as they could stand. Women were paid half the wages of men for twice the labor. Workplace injuries were common. Death was not a fluke. It was a risk factored into the cost of doing business. The idea that a worker might deserve a share of the value they produced was dangerous. Employers framed themselves as providers, job creators, builders of modernity. If the poor suffered, it was their own failure, not a flaw in the system. Wealth was seen as a sign of moral superiority, poverty as a personal defect. This ideology was not just cultural, it was codified. Governments, often in the pocket of industrialists, sent in police to break strikes and passed laws to prevent workers from organizing. But the workers organized anyway. Unions formed in secret. Meetings were held in taverns and basements. Leaflets were printed and smuggled across borders. What began as scattered resistance turned into a global movement. The demands were simple: better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions, and the recognition of human dignity. The response from capital was rarely subtle. Union leaders were jailed, blacklisted, or murdered. Strikes were met with lockouts, evictions, and sometimes bullets. Yet the movement grew. In 1848, a manifesto was published that gave voice to the rage simmering across the industrial world. Written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto called upon workers of the world to unite. Marx did not merely criticize capitalism, he dissected it. He argued that the system was built on exploitation, that profit was theft from labor, and that history was a series of class struggles destined to erupt. He predicted that the contradictions of capitalism would eventually collapse under their own weight, replaced by a classless, stateless society. For many, Marx's vision was both terrifying and exhilarating. To the industrial elite, it was a call to arms. To workers, it was a blueprint for resistance. Across Europe, socialist parties formed. Strikes became coordinated. Newspapers printed in multiple languages carried news of uprisings, demands, and victories. The working class was no longer a nameless mass. It had found its voice. In the United States, the contradictions of capitalism became most visible in the cities. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and later Eastern Europe flooded into New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. They built railroads, worked steel mills, sewed garments, and lived 10 to a room. They faced not only exploitation, but xenophobia, police repression, and political exclusion. Yet they fought. The 1886 Haymarket Affair in Chicago began as a peaceful protest for an 8-hour workday and ended in blood, chaos, and a bombing that sparked worldwide outrage. The labor movement was criminalized, but it could not be silenced. Labor unrest spread like wildfire. In Britain, the Chartists had already demanded voting rights for workers. In France, radical communes had seized control of cities, only to be crushed. In Germany, Bismarck responded not just with repression, but with the world's first welfare programs, an attempt to outflank socialism by offering state benefits. Everywhere, capital was learning that unchecked exploitation had a cost. And yet, the profits didn't stop. The great irony of the Gilded Age was that inequality was not a side effect. It was the engine. The system worked because labor was cheap. The wealth of nations rose on the backs of the very people it oppressed. Captains of industry, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, were hailed as visionaries while crushing unions and hoarding wealth. Philanthropy became a shield. Libraries were built while wages stagnated. Museums were opened while miners died underground. It was a spectacle of progress that hid the human cost. But workers had memory. They remembered the locked gates, the empty plates, the broken promises. They built institutions of their own: labor halls, cooperative stores, mutual aid societies. They created songs, slogans, and banners that passed from one generation to the next. The fight for labor rights became more than economic. It became cultural, a battle not just for bread, but for identity. Capitalism, for the first time, was under real pressure. Politicians had to respond. Some sided with business, others with labor. Legislation was passed, slowly, unevenly, often under duress. In time, child labor was restricted. Work days were shortened. Health codes were introduced. But for every gain, there was a backlash. The power of capital was not easily relinquished. It adapted, compromised, and in some cases, co-opted the language of reform to preserve its control. Still, the idea had taken root. That labor was not a cost, but a force. That workers were not tools, but people. That capitalism, unchecked, would devour itself. By the end of the 19th century, the working class had carved itself into history. It had fought for every right it possessed, and many it still lacked. It had turned factories into battlegrounds, tenements into organizing centers, and the language of economics into the language of revolution. The war between capital and labor was not over. It had only changed form. As the world marched into the new century, new ideologies, new technologies, and new markets would redraw the lines once again. But the echo of the picket line would remain. And the question, who truly builds the wealth of a nation, would never again be easy to ignore. Chapter 10. Capitalism in Crisis. The machine had been running hot. Industry roared, markets soared, wages inched upward. Skyscrapers clawed the sky. Radios sang promises of progress into every home. The American dream, it seemed, had become a global language, and capitalism its grammar. But beneath the optimism of the 1920s, the jazz, the lights, the stocks that never stopped climbing, something was unraveling. Capitalism was not just growing, it was overheating. And when it snapped, the world plunged into the deepest economic darkness it had ever known. October 1929. Wall Street cracked, then collapsed. Stocks didn't just fall, they plummeted. Fortunes evaporated in hours. Banks shuttered. Credit froze. Panic spread like fire through a parched forest. What had seemed like unstoppable progress now looked like a mirage. Within months, factories closed. Unemployment soared. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Families lost homes. Children went hungry. The rich lost money. The poor lost everything. The crash wasn't an isolated event. It was the symptom of a deeper sickness. Throughout the 1920s, wealth had concentrated at the top while wages stagnated. Production kept increasing, but demand lagged behind. Consumers bought on credit. Investors speculated with borrowed money. Banks made risky loans. And the stock market became a casino where the house always won, until it didn't. It was capitalism untethered, euphoric, and blind. When the collapse came, the old solutions no longer worked. Politicians clung to orthodoxy, balance the budget, cut spending, let the market correct itself. The invisible hand, they insisted, would restore order. But the hand had vanished. What remained was chaos. The world economy spiraled. In Germany, the fragile republic born after World War I buckled under the weight of reparations and depression. In Britain, unemployment topped 2 million. In the United States, a quarter of the workforce stood idle. Farmers plowed dust, bankers jumped from windows, children sold apples on corners. The myth of endless growth had died, and with it, the illusion that capitalism could govern itself. Into this vacuum stepped a new voice, measured, academic, and revolutionary. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, challenged the central dogma of laissez-faire capitalism. The market, he argued, was not a self-correcting system. It could stall, it could spiral. And when it did, government had to act, not by retreating, but by spending. In times of crisis, the state must step in, create demand, build roads, hire workers, and restore confidence. Capitalism, Keynes said, needed guidance, not shackles, but steering. His ideas were radical. They flew in the face of a century of economic faith. But reality was harder than ideology. In America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, a vast program of public works, financial regulation, and social safety nets. Dams were built, jobs were created, banks were restructured. The government became a participant in the economy, not just an observer. It wasn't perfect. Recovery was slow. Inequality persisted. But something fundamental had changed. The state was no longer the enemy of capital. It was its lifeline. And yet, even as democracies struggled to repair the damage, other forces gathered power by offering simpler answers. In Germany, Adolf Hitler blamed the crisis on Jews, communists, and traitors. In Italy, Mussolini offered the illusion of order through fascism. Across Europe and Asia, authoritarian regimes rose, promising discipline, unity, and strength. Capitalism, they claimed, had failed. The market was weak. The people needed control. The world edged toward war, not just between nations, but between ideologies. Democracy, fascism, communism, free markets, planned economies, totalitarian control. It was not only about borders, it was about systems. Could capitalism survive its contradictions? Or would it be swallowed by something more brutal, more absolute? World War II arrived not as a solution, but as a reckoning. Yet, paradoxically, it revived industry like nothing else could. War demands production: guns, tanks, ships, uniforms. Idle factories roared back to life. Millions were drafted. Millions more went to work. Unemployment vanished overnight. Women filled the roles men had left behind. Rationing replaced consumption. Governments borrowed, printed, and spent with no hesitation. Deficits ballooned. And yet economies grew. Capitalism was mobilized, weaponized, and re-engineered. But this was no free market. This was a command economy wearing capitalist clothes. The invisible hand gave way to state planning, price controls, and military procurement. Yet, in that paradox, a lesson was learned. When directed, capitalism could serve broader goals. Not just profit, but survival. When the war ended, the rubble told a brutal story. Cities flattened, nations bankrupt, millions dead. But among the ashes stood a strange possibility. The chance to build a new order, not from ideology alone, but from experience. Capitalism had been humbled. It had been saved not by its own logic, but by massive public intervention. The lesson stuck. In the United States, post-war planners embraced Keynesian economics. Government spending continued. Infrastructure boomed. Veterans received education, housing, and jobs. Wages rose. Productivity soared. A middle class emerged. For a time, it seemed capitalism had found its balance. Profit and protection, markets and moderation. But the scars of the Depression remained. People remembered the banks that failed, the landlords who evicted, the bosses who fired without warning. They demanded safeguards, social security, labor rights, unemployment insurance, financial regulation. Capitalism had survived, but only by compromise. The tension never disappeared. Even as prosperity returned, so did debate. Was Keynesianism a lifeline or a leash? Should the market be free, or should it be guided? Was the role of government to intervene, or to stay out of the way? The questions would return, louder, in decades to come. But in the aftermath of the Great Depression and the fire of World War, one thing was clear. Capitalism was not immortal. It could break, it could burn, and only through adaptation, painful, political, and imperfect, could it survive itself. The age of innocence had ended. The system that once promised infinite growth had shown its limits. Capitalism was not invincible. It was not pure. It was a machine driven by profit but reliant on people. And when the gears locked, it was the people who bled. The machine had restarted, but the warning lights were still flashing. Chapter 11. The American Dream Machine. The factories that once built bombs began building cars. The steel that had armored tanks now framed skyscrapers. In the quiet after the storm, the United States stood alone as the industrial superpower of the world. Europe lay in rubble. Japan was scorched and broken. The Soviet Union had bled itself to survive. But American cities gleamed. Its economy was intact, humming, and ready to shift from wartime urgency to peacetime consumption. And with it, capitalism entered its golden age, polished, patriotic, and mass-produced. This was the era when capitalism looked like a promise fulfilled. Wages rose, homes were built, children poured into schools. A new middle class exploded in size, carrying with it the hopes of a generation that had endured depression and war. The engine of prosperity was running at full speed, fueled by cheap energy, rising productivity, and the vast machinery of mass production. And at the center of it all stood a new icon, the American consumer. To consume was no longer a necessity, it was a duty. Cars, refrigerators, washing machines, once luxuries, now essentials. Television sets brought the world into the living room, along with jingles, commercials, and visions of a life well bought. Supermarkets replaced corner stores, highways cut across states. Fast food appeared on every corner. The modern American life was a product, and the assembly line stretched from Detroit to Hollywood. Suburbia became the landscape of the dream. The GI Bill offered returning soldiers access to low-interest mortgages and college degrees. Developers like William Levitt built entire communities in weeks. Rows of nearly identical homes with lawns, garages, and sidewalks. These weren't just houses. They were symbols of security, status, and belonging. The white picket fence became the boundary of aspiration. Inside, everything was new. Furniture, appliances, lives. And behind the scenes, capital flowed. The stock market soared, but quietly. Most Americans didn't trade stocks. They owned pension funds or company shares through their employers. Corporations grew large but stable. CEOs earned well, but not obscenely. The richest among them might make 20 times what their workers earned, not 200. Shareholders were important, but not sacred. Companies cared about their communities, at least outwardly. Loyalty was rewarded. A man might work 40 years at the same firm, retire with a gold watch, and live comfortably on his pension. This was the American dream machine in full motion. For millions of white, male, middle-class workers, it delivered. New cars every few years, vacations, college for the kids, security in old age. But the dream had limits. And those limits were written in race, gender, and geography. African Americans returning from the war found that the prosperity waiting for white soldiers was largely denied to them. Redlining kept black families out of the suburbs. Segregation ruled schools and workplaces. Even the GI Bill, hailed as a democratic marvel, was administered locally and often excluded black veterans through discrimination. While white families accumulated home equity and generational wealth, black families were locked out, forced into rental cycles in underfunded neighborhoods. The machine was selective. Women, who had entered factories en masse during the war, were pushed back into kitchens. Advertisements praised the modern housewife, whose fulfillment came through cleaning products, beauty creams, and well-cooked dinners. The economy depended on unpaid domestic labor to sustain the illusion of effortless middle-class life. The nuclear family became an economic unit, and women were expected to stay within its walls. Meanwhile, American capitalism was expanding outward. Through the Marshall Plan, the U.S. poured money into Europe, rebuilding markets and containing communism. Corporations stretched across borders. Coca-Cola, IBM, and General Motors became global brands. The Cold War hardened into an ideological battle between two systems, capitalism and communism. To be American was to be a consumer, and to consume was to be free. Economic growth became national pride. But growth had a shadow. Beneath the chrome and comfort, a quiet transformation was taking place inside the structure of capitalism itself. Shareholder value, once one goal among many, began to rise above all others. The post-war corporation, stable and socially embedded, began to shift toward something leaner, more aggressive, more obsessed with profit. But this shift wasn't yet dominant. In the 1950s and early 60s, stability still reigned. Government played an active role. Regulation was normal. Taxes on the rich were high. Unions were strong. Antitrust laws kept monopolies in check. It was a time of balance, but also of complacency. Productivity rose. So did wages. But so did the environmental cost. Rivers caught fire. Smog choked cities. Mountains were flattened. Waste was dumped. The dream machine had no brakes. It burned oil, belched pollution, and consumed resources as if they were infinite. Few noticed, fewer cared. Yet beneath the consensus, pressure was building. Outsiders looked in. Civil rights activists challenged the racial lies of the dream. Feminists questioned the roles assigned to women. Students protested the war in Vietnam and the consumerism they saw as hollow. The machine had made prosperity, but also conformity, exclusion, and silence. And even as capitalism thrived, its contradictions deepened. Growth had become the goal, but for what purpose? Ownership concentrated. Power ossified. Those outside the system were labeled lazy, criminal, or radical. Homelessness began to rise, even in the shadow of skyscrapers. In Appalachia, in the urban north, in the rural south, pockets of poverty persisted. The machine was selective not just in who it served, but in who it left behind. Still, the post-war era remained capitalism's high watermark. It showed that markets could be productive without being savage, that government could shape the economy without smothering it, that business could grow without devouring the society around it. For a few decades, the balance seemed possible, but it was delicate. Built on conditions, cheap oil, dominant industry, a compliant labor force, global supremacy, that would not last. The cracks were already forming. Inflation would rise, oil shocks would hit, global competition would return, finance would awaken, and the shareholder would soon take control. For now, though, the American dream machine still ran. It glided on highways, filled shopping carts, grew lawns, funded colleges. It offered a vision of capitalism as not just a system, but a life. Clean, safe, prosperous. But beneath the hum of refrigerators and the glow of televisions, something was shifting. The machine, so finely tuned, was beginning to lean forward, toward speed, toward profit, toward something sharper, colder, and far less balanced. The golden age had shimmered, but gold, after all, can tarnish. Chapter 12. Capitalist World. Reaganomics and Neoliberalism. The golden age of capitalism didn't collapse, it was dismantled. Piece by piece, policy by policy, speech by speech, the careful balance of the post-war economy was undone. What followed was not an accident, but a project to unshackle the market, shrink the state, and elevate profit above all. It had a smiling face, a simple message, and a new name: neoliberalism. Its prophet was Ronald Reagan. Its altar was Wall Street. Its promise was freedom. And its consequences would echo for generations. By the late 1970s, the post-war consensus was unraveling. Inflation soared, unions clashed with employers, oil shocks shattered confidence, factories closed, moving abroad or rusting in place. The dream machine sputtered. Politicians scrambled for answers. And into this crisis came a seductive idea. That government was not the solution, it was the problem. Ronald Reagan rode that idea into the White House in 1980. Charismatic, plain-spoken, and ideologically sharp, he offered Americans a new economic vision rooted in old beliefs. Cut taxes, slash regulation, trust the free market. The wealthy, he argued, would invest their gains, create jobs, and lift everyone. It was called trickle-down economics, but its real name was supply-side theory. Stimulate production, and growth will follow. The centerpiece was a massive tax cut. Marginal rates for the richest Americans were slashed from 70% to 50%, and later even lower. Corporate taxes were eased, estate taxes shrunk, capital gains were favored. The message was clear. Investment should be rewarded, not punished. Government's role was to get out of the way. But the cuts weren't matched by spending reductions. Military budgets ballooned. Social programs were trimmed but not eliminated. The result was predictable. Deficits exploded. Reagan had promised to balance the budget, but instead, he tripled the national debt. Fiscal discipline was no longer a priority. Growth was. And growth, for some, returned. Wall Street rejoiced. The 1980s became a playground for financial ambition. Banks merged. Hedge funds emerged. Junk bonds boomed. Leveraged buyouts became common. Risk was no longer feared. It was commodified, packaged, and sold. The stock market soared. So did executive compensation. The shareholder became king. The worker became a line item. Deregulation wasn't limited to taxes. The financial sector, once tightly controlled by post-depression laws, was unleashed. Interest rate caps were removed. Savings and loan associations were allowed to invest more aggressively. The idea was simple. Let the market innovate. But innovation, in this case, meant speculation. The S&L crisis soon followed, a preview of greater collapses to come. Meanwhile, the manufacturing base continued to hollow out. Jobs flowed overseas, where labor was cheap and regulations light. Factories in the Rust Belt closed, small towns withered. But consumer goods remained cheap. Big box stores spread. The credit card became a tool not just of convenience, but survival. Debt became normalized. To live the American dream, one no longer needed to earn it, just finance it. And still, the wealth gap widened. Reagan's policies weren't an aberration. They were the beginning of a global shift. In the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher launched a parallel crusade, breaking unions, selling off public assets, and preaching the gospel of privatization. Around the world, international institutions like the IMF and World Bank pushed austerity and deregulation on struggling nations, framing them as preconditions for growth. Neoliberalism became orthodoxy, not just in America, but everywhere. It was the new common sense. Markets were efficient, government was wasteful, and profit was proof of virtue. But behind the rhetoric was a reshaping of power. Labor lost ground, union membership declined, antitrust enforcement faded, monopolies returned in new forms. Tech giants, media conglomerates, financial behemoths. Wealth concentrated at the top, while wages stagnated below. The middle class, once the engine of American prosperity, began to shrink. Culture followed the money. Wall Street became a symbol not of greed, but of aspiration. Films like Wall Street warned against excess even as they glamorized it. Gordon Gekko's mantra, "Greed is good," became a slogan for a generation. Business schools taught students to maximize shareholder value. Success was measured not in innovation or community impact, but in returns. The safety nets of the New Deal era were slowly cut away. Welfare reform in the 1990s reinforced the idea that poverty was a moral failing, not a structural condition. Public housing was defunded. Public schools were pitted against each other. Healthcare remained tethered to employment and inaccessible to many. The state still spent, but less on protection and more on control. Policing and incarceration expanded. The market was free. The people were not. Technology accelerated everything. Personal computers became commonplace. The internet emerged. Finance grew faster, leaner, more complex. Algorithms replaced traders. Derivatives exploded. Markets no longer closed. They became 24/7, global and disconnected from tangible goods. Profit could be made from nothing more than volatility. But with speed came fragility. The system, now lean and over-leveraged, began to show cracks. Bubbles formed and burst. .com, housing, credit. Each time the same pattern repeated. Deregulation encouraged excess. Excess led to collapse. Collapse led to bailouts, and bailouts restored the system that caused the collapse. The logic of neoliberalism proved hard to kill, even when it failed. Still, for decades, it persisted. Trickle-down never truly trickled. Growth was real, but uneven. Productivity rose, but rewards flowed upward. Entire industries were outsourced. Job security became a relic. The gig economy replaced the stable paycheck. Pensions disappeared. Health insurance became a gamble. The American worker, once the pillar of capitalism, was now expected to hustle, adapt, and smile. The system rewarded short-term gains. Corporations bought back their own stock instead of investing in workers. CEOs earned hundreds of times more than their employees. Banks grew too big to fail. And politics, increasingly funded by private money, served the needs of capital first. Yet even in the heart of the machine, doubt crept in. Could endless growth be sustained? Could democracy survive inequality this deep? Could a system that required consumption also survive ecological limits? These questions, once fringe, began to surface. But the answers were postponed. The market, we were told, would figure it out. In the meantime, the numbers told a different story. Debt reached historic highs, personal, corporate, national. Home ownership declined, social mobility stalled. The dream that capitalism once promised, security, dignity, fairness, now seemed elusive for many. The world was richer than ever. But that wealth was concentrated, financialized, and often invisible to those who made the system run. Deregulation had freed the market, but it had also unmoored it. From responsibility, from restraint, from reality. Debt had kept the wheels turning, masking the hollowing beneath. Capitalism had not collapsed, but it had changed. It no longer wore the face of a factory boss. It wore the smile of a venture capitalist, the profile of a billionaire founder, the algorithm of a trading bot. And though the temples of finance still stood, the ground beneath them was beginning to shift. The story was not over, but the chapter had closed. The age of faith in free markets, endless growth, and invisible hands was ending. Something else was coming. Something louder, angrier, and harder to ignore. Chapter 13. Capitalism in the 21st Century. The 21st century began with a paradox. Never had capitalism delivered so much innovation, nor produced such stark inequality. As the world moved from steel to silicon, from factories to smartphones, from 9-to-5 jobs to gig work and global supply chains, the system evolved into something faster, more invisible, and harder to resist. The old factory gates were replaced by digital platforms. The clock was replaced by the algorithm. The office was replaced by the cloud. And yet, at the base of the shimmering digital pyramid, the old engines of labor remained. Sweat, risk, repetition, and silence. Outsourcing had once been a strategy. Now it was the norm. Manufacturing flowed to countries where wages were low, regulations light, and unions weak. Electronics were designed in California but assembled in China. Clothing lines were modeled in Paris but stitched in Bangladesh. Conglomerates no longer made things. They branded them, marketed them, shipped them. The making itself was someone else's job, often done in vast, windowless factories where 12-hour shifts were standard and safety was optional. Sweatshops, once condemned as relics of early industrial capitalism, thrived under new names. Industrial parks, export zones, special economic regions. Workers earned barely enough to survive, even as the products of their labor sold for hundreds or thousands of dollars in Western markets. In 2013, the collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh killed over 1,000 garment workers and exposed the human cost of fast fashion. But the outrage faded quickly. Consumers continued to buy. Profits continued to rise. At the other end of the value chain, A new elite emerged. Silicon Valley became the temple of innovation. Tech startups promised disruption, scalability, and exponential growth. With a laptop and a bold pitch, one could now raise millions in venture capital, build a platform, and scale it globally in months. Software didn't rust. Apps didn't require unions. Code scaled without borders. The language of capitalism shifted away from factories and into buzzwords: disruption, synergy, lean startup, network effect, unicorn. Companies that made no profit were valued at billions. Tech giants redefined entire industries without owning the things they displaced. Airbnb had no hotels. Uber had no cars. Facebook had no content. Amazon sold everything, but owned almost nothing it stocked. The platform was king, and the user was both product and customer. And behind the platforms, data accumulated like capital. Every click, every scroll, every search, captured, stored, and monetized. Surveillance became a business model. Advertising evolved into behavior manipulation. Algorithms decided what we saw, where we went, and what we wanted before we did. Privacy, once assumed, became a commodity to be traded or taken. Work, too, was reimagined, not improved, but fragmented. The gig economy promised freedom and flexibility, but delivered insecurity and constant hustle. Rideshare drivers worked without benefits. Food delivery couriers navigated cities under pressure from apps that rated their performance, but offered no sick leave or job protection. Freelancers stitched together incomes from short-term contracts, learning to brand themselves, market themselves, invoice, chase payment, repeat. They were not employees. They were independent. The burden of risk had shifted downward. In this new economy, the boundaries between work and life blurred. Laptops became offices. Phones became time clocks. Emails arrived at midnight. The hustle was glorified. The side hustle was mandatory. Productivity apps sold themselves as self-improvement, but in truth, they were extensions of a system that demanded constant output. Capitalism had found a way to colonize time itself. And yet, the innovation was real. Smartphones connected billions. Medical advances accelerated. Artificial intelligence promised new breakthroughs. Green energy technologies began to replace fossil fuels. Streaming replaced the movie theater. GPS replaced maps. 3D printers reshaped manufacturing. The cloud redefined infrastructure. Never before had the tools of creation been so accessible. But so too were the tools of extraction. Wealth concentrated at levels unseen in modern history. A handful of tech billionaires controlled more capital than entire nations. Their companies shaped public discourse, influenced elections, and dictated the terms of communication, commerce, and culture. Share prices soared. IPOs minted instant millionaires. Stock buybacks returned billions to investors. The S&P 500 boomed, but wages stagnated. The line split: those who owned equity and those who sold labor. The divide was no longer just between capital and labor, but between those whose incomes scaled and those whose didn't. A single app could generate millions for its founders while the drivers, creators, or freelancers behind it scraped to survive. The top 1% accumulated more than the bottom 90. The term middle class began to lose meaning in many parts of the world. Home ownership, once a cornerstone of security, slipped out of reach. Rent consumed paychecks, healthcare drained savings, student debt ballooned. Yet capitalism kept reinventing itself. Crypto promised decentralization and disruption of the financial system. NFTs redefined ownership. The creator economy offered a way for individuals to monetize attention, but only if they could game the algorithm, build an audience, and constantly produce. Every person became a brand, every brand a persona, every interaction a potential monetized moment. But the system was not invisible to those it left behind. Protests erupted around the world against inequality, against climate inaction, against housing crises and austerity. Workers at tech companies began to push back. Gig workers organized. Warehouse employees walked out. Calls for universal basic income, wealth taxes, stronger labor protections, and digital rights entered mainstream politics. The myth of infinite growth began to fray. And then came the shock. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 didn't break capitalism. It exposed it. Supply chains snapped. Essential workers were rebranded as heroes while still earning minimum wage. Billionaires added trillions to their wealth. Remote work expanded, office towers emptied, digital platforms surged in dominance. The stock market decoupled completely from the real economy. Governments intervened with stimulus, but the long-term cracks remained visible. The system had been running on speed. Now, it was unmasked. Still, innovation didn't stop. If anything, it accelerated. Automation advanced. Artificial intelligence began to replace not just physical labor, but cognitive work. Chatbots replaced clerks. Algorithms replaced editors. Robots moved from factories into warehouses, hospitals, and homes. The question now was no longer when the jobs would come back, but whether they ever would. Yet the structure held. Capitalism endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it was deeply embedded in every institution, every transaction, every choice. It offered convenience. It rewarded innovation. It delivered miracles and misery in the same breath. It gave billion smartphones and paid pennies to the hands that assembled them. As the 21st century advanced, the contradictions of capitalism grew sharper. It was the engine of prosperity and the amplifier of inequality. It created value and eroded stability. It gave voice to entrepreneurs and stole breath from laborers. It moved faster than governments could regulate, than societies could adjust. It scaled. It optimized. It disrupted. And still, it demanded more. The sweatshop hadn't disappeared. It had simply moved out of sight. The factory hadn't vanished. It had been compressed into a chip. And the worker? They were now logged in, rated, and tracked. Productivity had been redefined, but the pressures were the same. The question lingered. How long could the machine keep turning at this speed? Could innovation outrun instability? Could growth justify the imbalance? Or would the very tools that built this era begin to challenge its foundations? Capitalism had crossed into the digital age. The code had changed. But the logic remained. Produce, profit, scale, repeat. Chapter 14. Capitalism in Chaos. The 21st century promised speed, scale, and seamless connection. But instead, it delivered volatility. Boom followed bust. Confidence cracked. Systems designed for perpetual growth showed just how fragile they really were. And through each crisis, capitalism didn't collapse. It adapted, absorbed, morphed. But with each turn, the question deepened. How many shocks can a system take before it breaks? The first great warning came in 2008. What began as a ripple in the U.S. housing market turned into a tidal wave of global collapse. Banks that had seemed too big to fail did exactly that. Lehman Brothers vanished. Bear Stearns folded. Wall Street went white-knuckled. The problem wasn't just bad mortgages. It was the machinery built around them. Complex derivatives, bundled securities, and a vast web of opaque financial instruments few understood, but everyone trusted. The real estate market had become a casino. Loans were handed out with no checks, no income verification, no concern for repayment. These mortgages were sliced into tranches, sold to investors, rated as safe, and insured by institutions that couldn't cover the losses. When homeowners defaulted, the entire structure imploded. Credit froze, stocks plummeted. Millions lost homes, millions more lost jobs. Governments stepped in, not to punish, but to save. Trillions were pumped into the financial system. Central banks slashed interest rates to zero. Some companies were allowed to die, others were deemed essential and bailed out. The irony was sharp. In the age of deregulation, it was the state that saved capitalism. Banks had privatized profit for years. Now they socialized the losses. And while the bailout stopped total collapse, it didn't restore trust. People saw executives walk away with bonuses as foreclosure signs sprouted across suburbs. Occupy Wall Street rose not with demands, but with a simple declaration. We are the 99%. It was less a movement than a symptom, a roar of discontent with a system that seemed to reward recklessness and punish everyone else. Yet the markets recovered. The wealthiest rebounded faster than ever. Stocks soared, real estate bounced back, tech boomed, and beneath the surface, the ground shifted. A generation that had come of age during the crash began looking elsewhere for answers and alternatives. Crypto was one of them. Born from the ashes of 2008, Bitcoin arrived with a white paper, a pseudonymous creator named Satoshi Nakamoto, and a bold vision, a decentralized currency beyond the reach of banks and governments. It wasn't just about money. It was a rebellion. Blockchain technology promised transparency, autonomy, and a new kind of trust. No central authority, no intermediaries, just code. At first, few paid attention. Bitcoin was volatile, fringe, and mostly used by libertarians, tech enthusiasts, and criminals. But as years passed and the memory of the crash lingered, interest grew. Ethereum introduced smart contracts. Other coins emerged. Exchanges formed. Prices soared. A new language developed. HODL, DeFi, NFT, DAO. Crypto promised a financial system for the people, by the people. But it was also unstable. Scams flourished, fortunes were made and lost overnight. ICOs turned out to be vapor. Regulators scrambled to catch up. Still, the idea stuck. In a world where banks failed and governments wavered, crypto offered an alternative. Even if imperfect, it was different. And difference was enough. Then, just as the system seemed to find a new rhythm, the world stopped. COVID-19 hit like lightning. In early 2020, supply chains snapped. Borders closed, hospitals filled. Entire economies went into hibernation. Planes stopped flying, offices emptied, cities fell silent. For a moment, the hum of capitalism went mute. The initial market response was panic. Stocks crashed, oil prices went negative, unemployment spiked with terrifying speed. But this crisis was different. Unlike 2008, it wasn't a market failure. It was a biological shock. The system hadn't collapsed under its own weight. It had been blindsided by nature. Governments responded with unprecedented force. Lockdowns were imposed. Trillions in stimulus were unleashed. Central banks printed money at a scale never seen before. Direct payments were sent to citizens. Evictions were paused. Loans were frozen. For a brief moment, the impossible became policy. Capitalism, long allergic to state intervention, welcomed it with open arms. And it worked, at least on paper. Markets rebounded swiftly. Tech companies exploded in value. Remote work became normal. E-commerce soared. The digital economy thrived while the physical world trembled. Amazon, Zoom, and Apple broke records. Meanwhile, small businesses collapsed. Service workers faced unemployment or risked their lives. Essential meant expendable. The line between protected and vulnerable was drawn in code and capital. Inequality widened further. Billionaires added trillions to their net worth while millions relied on food banks. The same crisis that leveled cities deepened the divide. The recovery was not shared. It was split. Crypto surged again. Locked at home and unsure of the future, people turned to digital assets. Bitcoin hit new highs. NFTs exploded into the art world. Speculation returned in full force. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about control, or at least the illusion of it. If the traditional system was broken, why not try something else? Yet the volatility persisted. Crypto crashed again. Meme stocks soared, then plummeted. Retail investors fought hedge funds on platforms like Reddit. The rules seemed to dissolve. Markets became a theater of chaos and catharsis. Everyone wanted a piece of the action, but no one knew the ending. COVID also exposed deeper truths. Supply chains, once optimized for efficiency, proved brittle. Essential industries had been hollowed out. Globalism brought low prices, but also dependency. When China shut down, the world felt it. When ports backed up, shelves emptied. A virus in one corner of the globe brought capitalism to its knees. The system was global, but the response was national. The cracks widened. At the same time, debates about capitalism reignited. Should healthcare be privatized? Should profit dictate vaccine distribution? Should billionaires exist in a world where nurses reused masks? For many, the answer was no. For others, the solution was reform. For still others, it was acceleration, more markets, more tech, more innovation. And through it all, the question remained: when markets break, what holds? During the crash of 2008, it was the state. During COVID, it was again the state. Safety nets hastily stitched together. Central banks acting as lenders of last resort. Trillions in liquidity, bailouts, stimulus, support. In each crisis, the private system was stabilized by public power. And in each recovery, the profits flowed back to the top. Capitalism, it seemed, could survive anything, except success for everyone. The chaos of the 21st century had shown that the system was not designed for stability. It was designed for motion, for churn, disruption, reinvention. It could take a crash, absorb it, and pivot. But each crisis left scars. The trust frayed, the contradictions sharpened. Crypto was not the answer. Government was not the enemy. Growth was not the cure. The machine kept running, but louder, shakier, and harder to justify. And as the pandemic waned and the markets roared once more, the next challenge was already forming. A crisis that couldn't be bailed out. One that demanded something capitalism had always struggled to offer: limits. That crisis was coming fast. And this time, it wouldn't wait. Chapter 15. Growth in a Finite World. For centuries, capitalism thrived on a simple formula. Growth equals success. More factories, more goods, more markets, more money. Growth was not just a sign of health, it was the goal. A growing economy meant progress. A growing company meant power. A growing GDP meant national pride. But the planet did not grow. And now, in the 21st century, the contradiction has become impossible to ignore. Infinite growth in a finite system has met its limit. The climate is changing. The ice is melting. The forests are burning, the seas are rising. And capitalism, for all its innovation and promise, stands accused, not as the solution, but as the problem. The system was never designed with nature in mind. From its earliest days, capitalism treated the natural world as a free input. Forests were timber, rivers were energy. The air was an open dump. Land could be cleared, mined, sold, and replaced. Resources were simply there to be extracted. Profit rewarded those who took the most and paid the least. Externalities, pollution, depletion, extinction, were someone else's problem, often generations later. For a long time, the damage was hidden. The world seemed vast, the oceans endless, the sky unchanging. But with industrialization came scale. Coal powered the factories, oil fueled the engines, gas lit the cities, fossil fuels unleashed unprecedented productivity and unprecedented emissions. Carbon dioxide filled the atmosphere, slowly turning the thermostat up on the entire planet. At first, the signs were subtle. Strange weather, hotter summers. But then came the floods, the fires, the droughts. Climate change was no longer theory. It was lived experience. And yet, the machine kept turning. Emissions rose with GDP. Corporations profited from oil while denying its effects. Politicians delayed action in the name of jobs and stability. Growth remained the sacred metric. To challenge it was to challenge the entire logic of capitalism. Markets could price anything except survival. As the crisis deepened, a new language emerged. Sustainability, green growth, net zero. The idea was to reconcile capitalism with climate, to build a system that could profit without destruction. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, became a buzzword in boardrooms. Companies published glossy sustainability reports. Investors created green portfolios. Carbon credits were traded. Emissions were offset. Trees were planted. Hope was marketed. But behind the branding, the core logic remained untouched. Most ESG initiatives were voluntary, vague, and unregulated. Many were performative. A company might cut plastic straws while expanding oil drilling. Another might buy carbon offsets from forests already protected. Greenwashing became a strategy. Do the minimum, claim the maximum, keep the profits flowing. Even when well-intentioned, the results were mixed. Renewable energy expanded, solar, wind, batteries. But so did consumption. Electric cars replaced gas cars, but roads still widened, suburbs still sprawled, and factories still burned coal in the background. Smartphones became more efficient, but were replaced every 2 years. The question was never asked, what if we need less, not just better? Degrowth, a radical and often dismissed idea, began to resurface. Its premise was simple. True sustainability might mean doing less, producing less, consuming less. A steady-state economy, focused on well-being rather than output. But for capitalism, this was heresy. Growth was not optional. It was oxygen. Without expansion, the system stalled. Without returns, investors fled. Without profits, companies collapsed. The stock market could not price a plateau. And so the paradox deepened. To prevent ecological collapse, we need to slow down. But slowing down risks economic collapse. The system is locked in a loop. Growth causes crisis. Crisis demands growth. Disaster becomes opportunity. A flood creates construction jobs. A heat wave boosts air conditioning sales. A wildfire increases lumber prices. Profit doesn't stop. It adapts. Meanwhile, those who contributed least to the problem suffer first. Island nations drown. Drought hits subsistence farmers. Air pollution chokes the urban poor. Climate change magnifies inequality. It is not just a scientific challenge, it is a moral reckoning. Some argue that technology will save us, that markets will innovate, that capitalism will evolve. Carbon capture, geoengineering, fusion energy, smart cities, vertical farms, AI-optimized efficiency. The vision is seductive. Growth without guilt, a green capitalism, a circular economy, a world where we consume, clean, and continue. But time is short. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns of tipping points, moments when feedback loops spiral out of control. Melting permafrost, dying oceans, collapsing ecosystems. The damage is not linear, it's exponential. And while the market moves quickly, politics moves slowly. Lobbyists delay, voters hesitate, leaders promise, then stall. The private sector, for all its agility, cannot solve what it helped create without structural change. The rules must shift. Subsidies must end for fossil fuels. Polluters must pay real prices. Regulations must bite. Investment must prioritize resilience over returns. But these are not tweaks. They are transformations. And they require something capitalism has rarely tolerated: limits. The crisis is not abstract. It is everywhere. Hurricanes intensify. Fires spread. Ice melts. Crops fail. Insurance costs skyrocket. Migration increases. Conflict brews. And still, the question remains: can capitalism survive a planet it's helping to break? Or more urgently, can the planet survive capitalism? There are glimmers of change. Youth movements demand climate justice. Investors begin to consider long-term risk. Cities ban cars. Nations set emission targets. But the scale is not yet sufficient. The system resists. Every solution is filtered through the lens of profit. Every crisis becomes a market. And so we find ourselves at a crossroads. The 21st century will not be defined by technology alone, but by what kind of economy we choose. One that extracts, or one that regenerates, one that exploits, or one that endures. Capitalism has shown immense flexibility. It has adapted to war, depression, and pandemic. But nature is not negotiable. Physics doesn't yield to markets. The atmosphere has no patience. The clock is ticking. Growth was once the dream. Now it may be the danger. The very measure of our success may be the seed of our failure. Unless the system can be reimagined, radically, rapidly, and realistically, the machine may not break down. It may simply run out of road. Because the planet will go on. But whether we can live on it, that's the real question now. Chapter 16. The Future of Capitalism. The cracks are no longer subtle. Inequality is visible from space. The climate is shifting faster than models can track. Technology races ahead while governments lag behind. Workers are burned out. Renters are priced out. And younger generations increasingly ask a question that once seemed unthinkable. Is capitalism still working? For 2 centuries, capitalism has been the engine of immense transformation. It has created wealth on a scale previously unimaginable, lifted millions out of poverty, and driven technological innovation at breathtaking speed. But it has also produced volatility, dislocation, and crises: economic, ecological, and social. And now, in the 21st century, the system faces pressures it can no longer ignore. Reform feels too slow. Revolution feels too risky. But the status quo? That feels increasingly impossible. Across the globe, ideas that once lived on the fringe now enter mainstream debates. Universal basic income, once dismissed as utopian, is now being tested in cities and countries, from Finland to California. The idea is simple. Provide every citizen with a regular, unconditional cash payment, enough to cover the basics, regardless of employment status. Supporters argue it decouples survival from work, gives people breathing room to be creative, to retrain, to care for family, or simply to rest. Critics fear it's too expensive, too radical, too soft. But the appeal grows, especially as automation and artificial intelligence begin to replace not just manual labor, but cognitive work. Call centers are digitized. Legal research is done by algorithms. News articles are generated by bots. Artists are now competing with generative AI that can mimic style and speed. Entire industries may vanish, not slowly, but in waves. If jobs disappear faster than they're replaced, what happens to the foundation of capitalism? Wages? The 20th century economy was built on the assumption that most people would sell their labor in exchange for income. That model breaks down if machines outperform humans at everything from driving trucks to diagnosing cancer. What then? Retraining everyone every decade? For what? If machines don't need sleep, healthcare, or holidays, what exactly are people competing for? One answer is to revalue human contribution, not just as labor, but as citizenship. UBI is one approach. Another is reducing working hours, 4-day work weeks, job sharing, restructuring productivity not around profit alone, but around well-being. Some even propose post-growth economics, a model that abandons GDP as the primary metric of success and instead focuses on sustainability, health, equity, and resilience. Post-growth thinking asks a heretical question. What if growth is no longer the goal? What if maturity, not expansion, is what society should aim for? Trees grow tall, but they don't grow forever. Bodies develop, then stabilize. Why should economies be any different? For capitalism, this is a profound challenge. Growth is embedded not just in the language, but in the structure of the system. Corporations are designed to scale. Investors demand returns. Governments rely on growing tax bases. Slowing down feels like failure, even if it means survival. But some argue that capitalism itself is evolving. The rise of conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, ESG investing, all suggest that the system can reform from within. Companies now talk about purpose, not just profit. Impact investors measure social return. B corporations write ethics into their charters. Younger generations demand climate responsibility, diversity, and transparency. The shareholder may still be king, but the crowd is growing louder. Still, critics remain skeptical. Is this evolution or greenwashing? Reform or reputation management? Can capitalism be truly humane, or does it merely adapt its mask to match the moment? If the profit motive remains supreme, how deep can any change really go? In the shadows of these debates, revolution simmers. Not necessarily the armed kind, but the structural kind. Calls for wealth taxes, for dismantling monopolies, for nationalizing essential services like healthcare, housing, or broadband, for redefining ownership itself. Cooperatives, platform democracy, public banks. Digital technologies could enable a new kind of economic democracy. Imagine a platform where users are also owners, where profits are shared by those who generate the data, not just those who mine it. Imagine supply chains that are transparent end-to-end, revealing not just cost, but carbon, labor conditions, and ethical sourcing. Imagine a financial system where currencies are local, programmable, and tied to social goals. These aren't dreams. They're prototypes. Experiments are happening in cities, startups, and grassroots movements. Cooperative platforms, digital public infrastructure, participatory budgeting, regenerative agriculture, circular economies. The question is not whether change is possible, but whether it can scale in time. Because time is running out. The climate crisis imposes deadlines capitalism has never respected. Capital flows may ignore borders, but wildfires, floods, and rising seas do not. Ecological collapse is not an externality. It is an endpoint. And any system that demands extraction to survive will eventually run out of world to extract from. So we circle back to the central question: is capitalism still the best we've got? For some, the answer is yes, if it's heavily reformed, restructured, and restrained. They argue that markets can be harnessed, that innovation and entrepreneurship remain vital, that with the right rules and incentives, capitalism can adapt to serve humanity rather than dominate it. For others, the answer is no, that capitalism's DNA is too corrupted by inequality, competition, and growth addiction to ever become truly just or sustainable. They imagine new systems built from the ground up, decentralized, cooperative, ecological, and inclusive. Not tweaks, but transformations. And for many, the answer is uncertainty. We don't know what comes next. We don't know if reform will be enough. We don't know if revolution will be viable. But we know this: the old story is ending. The chapter of capitalism as we knew it, unregulated, infinite, blind to consequence, is closing. What comes next is still being written. In courtrooms and classrooms, in boardrooms and break rooms, in code and protest, in climate models and community gardens, in ballots and blockchains, in the choices we make, collectively and individually, about what we value, who we serve, and what kind of world we want to live in. Capitalism, like all human systems, is not a law of nature. It is a story we've told ourselves, and believed, and built. And if stories can be built, they can be changed. The question is not just reform or revolution. The question is, can we imagine something better? And are we willing to fight for it before it's too late? Chapter 17: Capitalism and the Human Condition. Capitalism is not just an economic system, it is a mirror. It reflects our fears and desires, our genius and our greed, our capacity to create and our impulse to consume. It has reshaped landscapes, rewritten laws, and redefined what it means to live, to work, to succeed. It built the modern world, its cities and corporations, its smartphones and skyscrapers, its markets and middle classes. But in doing so, it also exposed something deeper, something more human: the tension between freedom and inequality, between ambition and meaning. No other system has unleashed so much potential. Capitalism rewarded risk, turned ideas into industries, and allowed people, at least some people, to rise beyond their birth. It promised that what you could earn mattered more than who your parents were, that value was something you could create, not something you had to inherit. It replaced feudal chains with contracts, royal privilege with enterprise. It offered mobility, it offered choice, and to many, it offered hope. But it was never neutral. It rewarded not just work, but leverage, not just invention, but ownership, not just talent, but timing. It told stories of self-made success, while quietly compounding inherited wealth. It sold the dream of equality, but ran on scarcity. It praised hard work, but paid capital more than labor. It asked everyone to run, but started some at the finish line. And it made freedom complicated. Capitalism promised freedom through the market, freedom to buy, to sell, to move, to choose. But the more central the market became, the more it defined freedom itself. Health became a product. Education became a service. Time became a cost. The freedom to succeed came bundled with the freedom to fail, without safety, without shelter, without care. For those with wealth, freedom expanded. For those without, freedom often shrank into survival. Ambition flourished, so did anxiety. The pressure to climb, to achieve, to earn, never stopped. There was always someone doing better, always something new to buy, always more to want. Rest became a luxury. Enough was never enough. People were measured by their output, their productivity, their salary, their brand. The marketplace extended into identity. Every resume, every profile, every curated image became a pitch. And beneath it all, a quiet emptiness grew. Capitalism could fill stores, but not souls. It could deliver comfort, but not purpose. It could offer distractions, but not connection. For all its abundance, it left many hungry. For meaning, for belonging, for something that couldn't be bought. In a system that valued efficiency above all, the messy, slow, fragile parts of being human, grief, play, kindness, stillness, were pushed to the margins. And yet, we return to it, again and again, because it worked. Or at least, it worked better than anything else we'd tried. It adapted. It evolved. It survived depressions and revolutions, wars and pandemics. It wrapped itself around democracy, around technology, around the very language of progress. It gave us medicine and music, mass education and microchips. It gave us choice, though not always the power to choose. It made us rich, but not equal. It made us fast, but not wise. It made us connected, but not close. Capitalism did not cause every problem of the modern world, but it amplified many of them. Climate change is not the child of greed alone. It is the byproduct of scale, of speed, of a system that rewards extraction and punishes restraint. Inequality is not a flaw in the design. It is often the point. The system grows when differences grow, between owner and worker, between north and south, between those who lend and those who borrow. And yet, we are not trapped. We are participants. Capitalism is not nature. It is a structure we maintain, a script we follow. It can be rewritten, and it already has been, many times. The capitalism of the spice trade is not the capitalism of the stock exchange. The capitalism of the coal mine is not the capitalism of the algorithm. The system has mutated across centuries, reshaped by revolutions, by crises, by laws, by people. What we call capitalism today is not a fixed formula, but a moving target. It has no single author, no sacred text. It is whatever we allow it to be. And so the future remains open. We may choose to reform it, to tax more fairly, to regulate more wisely, to embed ethics into the code of profit. We may push for stronger social safety nets, for green investment, for universal care. We may demand more transparency, more accountability, more balance between growth and dignity. Or we may go further, rethinking the very foundations, questioning the primacy of markets, redefining value beyond price, imagining economies that serve life, not just output. Some call this post-capitalism. Others call it justice. But whatever comes next, it will be shaped not just by systems, but by us, by what we believe, by what we tolerate, by what we dare to imagine. Because capitalism, in the end, is not just about money. It is about people. And people are capable of more than profit. We are capable of care, of cooperation, of restraint, of building not just wealth, but meaning. Capitalism has been a powerful tool. It has revealed who we are. It has tested our values. It has pushed us to innovate, to connect, to compete, to expand. It has also pushed us to the edge of inequality, of exhaustion, of ecological collapse. And now, the choice is ours. We can keep running in circles, chasing a dream that always moves just out of reach. Or we can stop, look around, and ask a different question. Not how to make capitalism work better, but what we want from our lives, our work, our world. Because the future is not a market. It is a story, and we are the ones writing it.